When Mafia Definitive Edition released in 2020, many of us, including myself, got to experience the first Mafia game for the first time. To those who were new to the experience, it was another opportunity to be a fashionable mobster beating the daylights out of rival mob fellows with a baseball bat, engaging in high-intensity chases, and soak in a de facto new entry to the series, even if it's technically also the first game in disguise, to take in the glorious sights of Lost Heaven, to do organised criminal activity and listen to the radio, and avoid the tunnel like the plague. This ground-up total remake of the 2002 title Mafia was praised at launch for its faithful recreation of a classic, but to some it was perhaps too faithful. To others, not faithful enough. What does that mean? Well, it's an odd one really. When remakes and remasters crop up, there are two camps of opinion that dominate discourse. Those who are happy to see a game updated, brought in line with modern titles, and given a new lease of life, the chance to appeal to a new generation altogether. Then you have those who staunchly stand by the older versions of the titles, not necessarily understanding the need for remasters or remakes, not fathoming why a company would prefer to remake a game or allocate time to something already long released over just creating something completely new. And I've always understood both trains of thought. On the one hand, the original title is an art piece in itself, and it's hard to shake the thought remasters and remakes can somehow skew that. Imposing a new flavour on something once appreciated is a very fine line to walk. On the other hand, remakes allow you to enjoy the game like it's new. We get that classic story with updated visuals, updated gameplay, updated atmosphere, audio design, maybe a new cast to breathe new life into the characters, or at least to complement the other updates. And this is what this game strives for. Mafia Definitive Edition, as a result, was a weird game, as remakes tend to be. It had to juggle modernising a title from a time when technology only had so much wiggle room, and now those limitations have largely been stripped. Where do you draw the line between a faithful reimagination and an entirely new game? I'd need a point of comparison to ponder that topic in any acceptable degree of depth, but what I can acknowledge is Mafia Definitive Edition is still weird. It's not bad, I really enjoyed playing it, but it's weird. It boasted updated visuals, more modern as in easier to adjust to gameplay, updates to the storyline, an entire new cast to bring the characters to life, and yet all of it is glued onto the skeleton of a game that feels much older. And the time has finally come to do a video on it, even if only for the sake of completing the series. After all, I did a video on Mafia 3, Mafia 2 and its DLCs, the old country now that it's out. Don't ask about the order, my mind obviously works backwards. And now finally, let's take a gander at the now 5-year-old remake of the game that started it all. Mafia Definitive Edition. Right, to begin with, we play as Tommy Angelo, a taxi driver who gets held hostage by two mobsters named Sam and Paulie, and forced to engage in a high-speed chase through the streets of Lost Heaven, a fictional city primarily based on the likes of Chicago. The year is 1930. Prohibition is in full swing, meaning America is too sober for there to be balance, and the economy's on its arse like somebody had given Liz Truss a time machine. None of that matters right now though, as Sam's got a gun to our head, so we've got to drive recklessly and hope Sam's got an iron finger. Tommy naturally takes this opportunity to impress his captors by showcasing his raw driving talent. He can drive in a straight line, and asserts his dominance by ignoring roadworks. Upon delivering the gentlemen to their destination in mostly one piece, Tommy sits in his now bullet-ridden taxi and waits. He's given some cash for his trouble, and returns to his life as a cabbie, uninterested in the mobster ways. In continuing his taxi driving career though, he realises that people suck, giving him meagre fares to drive them from A to B, often being obnoxious. Surely there's more to life than this. The situation gets worse when some yobs prang up his cab and prepare to issue him a very undeserved beating. This man has had a very hard week. So he absconds right into the arms of his former captors who protect him. Turns out they're enforcers for Don Salieri, and from here, Tommy finds himself among those ranks too. Morello's men smashed up our taxi, so we joined the mob. It's a bit of a weak hook, to be honest. But it gets the job done, and more importantly the point across that it's easy to fall in with organised crime, particularly when you want payback against some mobsters because they smashed up your taxi because you were held hostage by other rival mobsters, because at least the first lot of mobsters were respectful about it. So we smack up some cars and some blokes, set fire to their cars as insult to injury, and embark on a new life of gangster. Now you're likely thinking that didn't necessarily feel hugely earned. But for a game from a time when prioritising getting to the meat of gameplay perhaps was more valued over a leisurely paced plot, you can sort of understand it. It's that old game skeleton I alluded to before. And it's not like that's all that's going on. Tommy is, after all, telling his story to an Irish detective in a bar after the fact, and that serves as something of a binding agent for the episodic snippets of his life. Anyway, our duties as gangster include driving, shooting people, driving, climbing, driving, planting explosives and reaping the consequences, driving, carrying out meticulously organised assassinations, driving. You know, basic mobster stuff. Did I mention driving? We drive a lot of cars. We're the best wheelman in the family. After all, we are the player character. And Tommy was a cab driver, so that means disregarding the rules of the road and yet somehow making it to his destination in one piece is second nature to him. I actually don't understand what it is that Tommy does before being branded the best driver that grants him such status. He just drives his taxi like he's got a gun to his head and nothing to lose. Because he does in fact have a gun to his head and nothing to lose. And if firming being taken hostage is enough to be welcomed into the family, it makes you wonder what other strays they let in. And considering how fiddly the driving can be, I'd imagine Tommy's closer to the worst driver in the city. Now, I don't want this video to become solely a narrative analysis, as there are dozens available on YouTube, all done by people with greater brains than my own. While I will touch on some story stuff, as it's one of the game's primary strengths and greatest flaws, I would like to first acknowledge what Mafia Definitive Edition absolutely thrives on. And that, in one word, is vibes. This game's atmosphere is great. This recreation of a 1930s city feels, I wouldn't say alive as such. I think in my time on this platform I've reached my quota for vomiting out that cliche. The Mafia games have never been about open world, so soaking it in as more than a backdrop is besides the point, but it feels convincing for the purposes of telling the story. Graphically, obviously, the game looks aesthetically robust. It's a remake that came out in 2020. If it didn't look good, what was the point? But I'm more talking about the immersion factor. Driving around the streets of Lost Heaven, you have to obey the speed limit or the police come and slap a ticket on you. It's rendered meaningless by this game's foregoing of any actual in-game currency, but it's there for pure immersion's sake anyway, and you can up the ante with police in a simulation setting that makes them more alert to any traffic laws you violate, such as running red lights. Lost Heaven otherwise looks phenomenal, particularly in the rain. I don't know what it is about rain. I think it's the idea that you're a trench coat and a fedora away from feeling like either a noir detective or a crazed loner who spends his days talking to swans in a local park. And the Mafia games give you a trench coat and a fedora. Sometimes, at least. So there's something for your imagination to play around with. I just adore the oozing atmosphere of nighttime in this game in the rain. There's something intense about investigating an abandoned farm during a heaving thunderstorm that really draws you into the moment, at least until the frame rate shits itself. Driving through the city listening to the radio, hearing news reporters talking about sports rivalries between Lost Heaven and Empire Bay was another highlight. Not because I gave a toss about what was being said, though I most certainly appreciated the radio consisting of more than just music, but because the drive took me into a tunnel underneath a river and the radio picked up interference and became inaudible.
WLH 570 Lost Heaven Radio will carry live coverage of the final game of the Gold Series.
Such an insanely cool detail. While in this tunnel, the radio can't pick up a clear signal, and as a result you get nothing but static until you emerge at the other side. Stuff like that really makes a world's believability, and I think that's something that was actually in the original game. I furthermore respect when a game's radio stations have more meat to them than just music. I love music as much as the next Matt, don't get me wrong, I've not met somebody who doesn't like music. But hearing news reports keeps you up to date with the occurrences of the world. Sometimes the reports are about your actions in the story and that adds another layer because it's the illusion those events had an impact. Other times it's about benign things that just add lore to the world. Then there are the newspapers laying around. You can read about the times, about the Great Depression, Prohibition, you know, standard 1930s America stuff. Nothing original as such, but it does the job at making the world feel like it exists, demonstrating the struggles people at this time in this place had to deal with. Chiefly a miserable economy the state forced them to stay sober through. The truth is, making a world compelling isn't always about standing out. It's about doing the simple things that reliably work to make a world believably. Obviously, a good story helps, and a game with as much depth as possible never goes amiss, but what I mean is, Lost Heaven is believable. The city is crammed with the small details. The visuals really are enhanced by intense weather, seeing light reflect off puddles while walking down the street. You get the idea. Immersion is partially achieved through the things nobody gives a second thought to in the real world, because that makes the world seem less contrived. You don't think about all the puddles on your way home after a hard rainy day at work. Neither does Tommy Angelo, I'd imagine, but their inclusion is an important piece to making the world atmospheric because of that passive role it takes in an environment, whether real or fictional. I didn't expect to fixate on puddles, but it's a reasonable example of what I'm trying to convey. So, radio static in tunnels. If anything, it's annoying in the real world if you still listen to the radio instead of using one of those dodgy Bluetooth devices to whack on your own tunes like an absolute madman, but here it's just a fact of the experience. Were it not in the game, nobody would go, gosh, I really wish there was some interference in this here tunnel, but it was included and it feels right. Mafia Definitive Edition is good at drawing you into its moments, into the experience of going from A to B. It has means to make even that rather bland drive across town feel more real with manual driving. Obviously the series classic cops that don't like when you violate traffic laws, which stands out against the backdrop of other games that entail driving where cops aren't all that concerned with the player doing 200 miles per hour through suburbia provided you don't kill anybody. You have to treat the driving like a task itself rather than a time-filling chore between two key points. You obey the speed limit. With the appropriate setting you have to avoid running reds, otherwise you're only making your life more difficult. You might get slapped with a ticket, or you might provoke a chase. With the added thought manual driving adds, avoiding that becomes not just something that characters surely want, but the player too, because it's unnecessary. Were this a longer game, with more and more auxiliary tripe filling its runtime, features like this would become a chore to engage with. But since the game is entirely narratively driven, it works. Now gameplay wise, I think Mafia Definitive Edition had a very hard time making waves. The mission structure is very quintessential Mafia. After all, it's a remake of the first game, so you'd hope so. What this means is, like other Mafia games, a lot of the time is consumed by driving from one part of the map to another, listening to dialogue if you've got passengers, or otherwise just going where you need to go. There's an option to skip unnecessary drives, but I didn't choose that because I don't really want to leave it up to the game to decide what's necessary this late. Surely if a drive was unnecessary, the game wouldn't have it at all. But beyond driving, there's plenty of scrapping going on, as you'd naturally expect or understandably be very disappointed. The gameplay from here moves in three directions: gunplay, melee, and stealth in certain circumstances. Gunplay is serviceable. You shoot people, they die. If you get shot too much, you might die. And your health only replenishes at medicine cupboards, so you have to control how many bullets you take over the course of a fight until you find the next one. So you have an incentive to cling to cover rather than John Wick your way through a shootout. I like the idea. Bullets don't just temporarily hurt. Being shot even once in the real world is a big problem, and games often undersell this reality for the sake of a clean shooter experience. While the Mafia games have always put emphasis on healing manually if you want to keep eating shots because it nerfs the power fantasy. We're playing as a gangster after all. A gangster who became one because his taxi got banged up and that led him to the Salieri crime family. Not a super soldier like Lincoln Clay virtually is in Mafia 3. The fights need to be challenging if you disregard prioritising survival in particular. I do think, however, the old country certainly demonstrated this disadvantage better with the stealth focus, and even then it's a bit of a wasted effort, and Mafia 2's gunplay feels as if it nails that more intense vibe to the fights. For the most part, Mafia Definitive Edition plays like any third-person shooter might, in a vague roundabout sense. People online call its gunplay rough. I don't think it is as much that as it is just kind of a bit flat. When it clicks, it's buttery smooth, and the close quarters shootouts it prioritises especially. Though at range, it's a different story, where it feels like a festival of potshots, so if anything, it's just an average shooting system. You have a modest assortment of weapons, of which you can only carry 2 guns at a time, and you have some throwables so you don't have all sorts stuffed down your trousers, like you might in, say, Grand Theft Auto, but it's still a bit weird that when the weapon isn't equipped it's invisible, as that implies the Tommy gun is hidden down his pants. Considering the game's narrative focus, it would have been more interesting to see the heavier weapons slung around Tommy's shoulder, where they can be seen and draw more attention, highlighting the importance of only equipping them to your inventory when you expect a shootout, and making any ambushes or unexpected fights more intense, as you'd often start with only a handgun. It's splitting hairs, but it's something the old country did to a point, so props. Now, people say the gunplay in this game feels dated. The only thing that's really dated about it is the circular reticle for pistols. It feels very vague for that kind of weapon, so I can see where they're coming from. It's not as reliable as the crosshair you get with the Tommy gun, and looks kind of dated. It just means your shot will land somewhere in that circle, so its margin of error is small enough that it'll do the job, but sometimes you'll just miss shots you really shouldn't. Otherwise, the gunplay doesn't do anything that stands out. There are moments the environment does the heavy lifting to give you an event that feels satisfying to be involved in, but the gunplay itself is very non-spectacular. That being said, it gets the job done. Shooting at other cars while driving, however, didn't feel remotely satisfying in the slightest. Just unload your unlimited ammo clip by clip as quickly as possible until your aim-assisted shooting causes your target to conk out. Just felt like a stand-in for an area they couldn't leave blank, but also couldn't come up with a system that requires attentiveness. So I much preferred moving shootouts where Tommy was a passenger. In these moments, while it reverts to the fundamental gunplay, it's like I said about the environments, there's a sense of occasion at least, and the event becomes an exhibition of the atmosphere. Aiming may be down to you in these moments, and the occasion may revert to point and shoot, but there's so much more going on to latch onto. Shooting the engines of a plane as it's about to take off and you're chasing it down the runway as you sat in the passenger seat of the car is more interesting than a generic chase through downtown Lost Heaven, where when you take out one enemy vehicle, 2 more seem to take its place. And gameplay amounts to simply driving intensely while you're spamming a button because the aiming is automated. Now, you could take to the settings and disable the aim assist and then have to aim manually while driving, but if aim assist is a default, there is typically a reason. And question arises, will disabling it for the sake of these chases make the chases actually more interesting? Particularly to the acceptable standard that justifies the hike in the challenge? I don't know. Anyway, as for melee combat, it's not exactly difficult. Even against a mass of enemies, you chiefly fight them one at a time, so you dodge their attacks by pressing a button, then smash them until they fall over, or you get a janky finisher animation that looks, if anything, quite gentle. The dynamic doesn't change much, if at all, for having a baseball bat or a knife, so they are just consistently easy, and sadly quite unimpactful. And then there's a lot of jank, as the finisher animations have absolutely no transition whatsoever. As for the stealth, when the game deploys it as a necessity, it works nicely. Being detected by one enemy doesn't necessarily mean blanket detection, so I'm quite fond of that. Otherwise, it's quite straightforward. Sneak up on enemies and choke them out, or sneak past them and don't. Animations again run the serious jank risk, but overall when the game tastefully and sparingly deploys stealthy encounters, they're functional, if a little simplified. Now, the driving is something I wanted to go back to because it is fun. I like that the cars feel like 1930s vehicles. Not that I've personally driven any in my time on this earth, but they're far less refined than you'd expect of a modern car in a game. Your garage has a random muscle car in it for some reason, and in manual the thing is undrivable. But for the vehicles that are historically reasonably accurately designed, they're great fun to find the limits of. The limits are quite simple. Brake before you reach a corner, or you'll find the car might turn but will continue going forwards. So you've got to be attentive or your closing move will be the Bradford Drift. Driving is enhanced by the manual setting, I find, which means you have to change up and down, and while I couldn't bring myself to make my life more difficult with simulation driving, I loved how the manual transmission made driving an engaged activity, and only switched it off towards the very back end of the story, when the novelty wore off and driving a big lorry became an exercise of shifting up and shifting down, while not actually going very far. I also like that if you use the brakes with this setting enabled, you no longer start reversing upon becoming stationary, and instead have to downshift into reverse and use the right trigger to move like a car ordinarily would require you to do. After all, in real life you don't just jam the brakes until they start producing the opposite of forward motion. It has its drawbacks in intense gameplay as it's fiddly to remember, the simple act of shifting on a controller after crashing into a lamppost while under heavy fire, so mistakes in driving become more punishing. But in leisurely transit through the world, it brings you into the moment and allows you to soak it in more. It also makes becoming competent at the driving harder, and therefore justifies the plot idea of Tommy theoretically being a driver with divine skill. When you pull off what the game is asking of you, it therefore feels more rewarding. When the onus is on the player to select a vehicle, you'll choose one that you're most familiar with, so that driving across town to your objective can be satisfying rather than a drab slog through downtown traffic, simply to kill time for adequate exchanges of dialogue and to otherwise pad out runtime. The handling characteristics of performance vehicles and trucks tend to differ in any game, especially those that offer a variety of cars you can drive. But with the manual gearbox option, the difference is even more noticeable. It's not just about how quickly a car can turn, or how fast it is, and how much pushing it you can get away with. You have to observe the rev counter change up at the right time, change down at the right time to balance power output and control. A heavy lorry will be geared differently to a sports car. That, in tandem with the standard differences, makes the distinction especially memorable. Driving a truck feels like you may as well be driving a garden shed, and that's not in simulation mode, so God knows how agonising it must be. But driving a race car, now that truly feels like you're sitting atop a wild, unruly, untamed beast, yearning to wheelspin its tyres clean off, before bolting at 3 digits miles per hour through the nearest school zone en route to the sturdiest tree. And this is where Mafia Definitive Edition's notorious racing mission enters discourse a lot. Some people find it to be a pain in the backside, and yeah, I can see why. You have to drive as fast as possible, and the race cars are like untamed beasts, so you have to wrestle for control the whole 3 laps or the car ends up doing whimsical things. I personally like the intensity of it. Race missions in games where they aren't the primary focus especially are often too easy. Get ahead and hold the lead and nobody else seems to seriously challenge you for it unless you crash, but here it feels like even if you're ahead, the other cars are biting at your heels. You get the sense that mistakes will be heavily punished, and that cautions you to drive focused and to the best of your ability. But the challenge can very easily sour somebody because of how absurd and unnecessary the scenario that facilitates it actually is. Tommy's a former taxi driver turned mobster. He ingratiated himself with the mob by jumping a bridge while under duress. Why is he entering into the Grand Prix? Never mind putting to shame seasoned racing drivers. Bearing in mind he had absolutely zero prep time and was kind of dropped in it last minute. Aside from that, the only noteworthy aspect to the driving is Tommy's ability to drive through roadworks to create breaks in chases. It's quite handy if you need a quick getaway to make note of these marked dug up roads and make use of them to put some distance between yourself and any pursuers. It's also a smidgen daft because somebody left out a perfectly good ramp for us to use to keep control of the vehicle through these roadworks, and our pursuers, who are either hardened mobsters themselves or indeed the police, absolutely balls it up reliably to give the roadworks purpose, when they could in theory be as capable at driving as we supposedly are. Overall though, gameplay is largely of the unremarkable standard. It's good enough to not be a problem area, but not necessarily great enough to be memorable. Despite this game being a remake of a classic, there were huge missed opportunities to inject depth into the gameplay loop. You take your cars as you get them. You can't take them to a mechanic to change the plates and have them say whatever license plate length stupid thing comes to mind, like you could in Mafia 2 for instance. That would have been cool to see. There's no in-game currency, so getting pulled by the police has a meaningless interaction rather than giving us something to lose to motivate us to not do that. There are no shops for us to purchase snazzy new suits to get blood on. You get an assortment of clothing across the story, but you can only access them when you should be donning them. I suppose they symbolise Tommy rising up the ranks because the story's very touch and go when it comes to elaborating that in any other way. You can choose your look in free ride mode though, if you can stomach the sluggish forced walk up to the wardrobe in Salieri's bar. At least there's an extra clown costume though, which looks delightfully horrifying. God forbid somebody give this man a knife. There's no lasting wanted system as seen in Mafia 2. If you escape police, they forget about you. I'm sure I'm missing off some things like cafes to immerse yourself in the world and perhaps even needing to refuel your car. After all, we have the graphic for it, but not any application for that information. Or indeed, things to see occurring in the streets in passing to bring this remake in line with the standard set by the game's technical pre-existing sequel. Sure, being a remake of a 2-decade-old experience afforded it some slack, but to judge it on its own merits, I think they could have done a lot more in subtle ways to make Mafia Definitive Edition richer and perhaps even more immersive beyond the features that are present. Even if only for the sake of it, but I understand why they didn't. Under the bonnet, this is still a 2-decade-old game, or at least it's trying to be as faithful to a 2-decade-old game as possible. And while I'm not qualified to draw comparisons and make an argument as to whether or not it accomplished that, there's a technically newer game I can compare it to Mafia 2 and make the observation that that game excels in areas that this one doesn't really seem to think about. Without misrepresenting Mafia 2 as somehow being God's gift to gaming, and also acknowledging its own respective definitive edition wasn't very definitive, it's weird that this technically newer title doesn't bid to surpass that bar or even meet it, regardless of whether or not it's a recreation of something much older. It's a remake, it should be a reimagination of that game that really digs into the scope of what's possible. That goes way beyond superior graphics and more accessible gameplay. If anything, it gets slack for sometimes not doing that because it's a remake. But it's still a newer Mafia title from 2020 that lacked as much depth as a Mafia game from 2010. Not in all areas, of course. Narratively it does fine, if not fantastically. But certainly on the gameplay and immersion front, while it has some successes, it doesn't quite manage to be as potent as an older title. And this is most observable in the things it doesn't do that Mafia 2 did to make moving through its world a journey, however unnecessary those features might actually be. But I suppose that's the saving grace. Through the unnecessary aspect, it doesn't necessarily lose quality where it matters for what it doesn't do. So with that, let's shift on to talking about what matters most to Mafia Definitive Edition. And that is, of course, the narrative. This game's storytelling is its primary focus and greatest strength, there's no arguing against that. Not only was it rich and full of character goodness, regardless of whether or not it's a story from a 2002 game, it was refreshing following Mafia 3. I would say Mafia 3's story was strong, but it was very difficult to appreciate, and that was the game's own fault more than anything. And that's because the plot was drip-fed to us, in between hour-long bouts of mandatory redundant open-world content. So if you're not paying any attention when the one cutscene you'll get for the next 2 hours comes along, who can blame you? Mafia Definitive Edition's plot though takes priority over everything else, allowing you to actually become invested. Because of that, the story being good is a must, and it certainly surpasses that bar. I was particularly convinced by the dynamic of Tommy, Sam, the hardened mobster, and Paulie, the certified lunatic, as their friendship developed over the course of the 8 years the narrative takes place over. I enjoyed soaking in the moral dilemma that Tommy is consistently confronted with. His conscience, if anything, grows as he's increasingly exposed to the brutality of the mob. He reflects on how buying into that family finish leads to an incredibly slippery slope until suddenly you're in too deep to get out. And as he starts his own family, he begins to see how his ruthless lifestyle is utterly incompatible with that, and that strains his loyalty to Don Salieri. But of course this bubbles over time, forcing him to torment his morality further with more compromise, sometimes leading to moments where he goes against those orders, and all he has to do is hope those decisions don't catch up with him. And of course that leads us to another theme, the illusion of loyalty, particularly in organised crime. His moments of disobedience are opportunities for betrayal from his closest allies. Not so much with Paulie, who wants an out before Tommy realises he wants the same, but certainly for Sam, who's built up enough knowledge to betray them both for his own ambitions, placing Tommy on the Don's to kill list, forcing him to resort to seeking out police protection in exchange for testifying against Don Salieri. And while that grants him time to see his family flourish, it ultimately proves to be a tragic act of self-sacrifice. Despite the message's extreme formatting, it has an applicable interpretation. Be very careful who you call friend, because some are only allies so long as your goals align. So yeah, the story is valuable and enjoyable and then some. I'm likely underselling it, but there are many narrative analyses available. But I found the delivery limited certain aspects. You see, the narrative format is very 2002 game at its core, despite the remake boasting a new cast, meaning they could have expanded beyond that technological limitation if they wanted, and at points I'm led to believe they did. I won't go spotting issues with it being a linear experience. I like that, if anything. Even if I think Mafia 3 didn't do well as an open world game was nothing to do with making it an open world game, but rather underestimating what goes into making one. But it does help give this story a very episodic structure. Over the 8-year time period we observe, we're given slim windows to observe the characters and their dynamics, and the events when they're most intense. But a lot of important events happen between the pages in the script, and are simply addressed via exposition, as the entire plot is basically a summary of a decade's worth of gangster shenanigans as Tommy chews the ear off a detective in a diner. Now, some of the things that occur between one mission and the next would have been ideal to see, so we can make more sense of things, maybe even without the whole exposition angle being so prominent. Instead, the storytelling is still tailored towards dropping us into the action as quickly as possible, rather than necessarily building up to it from the start of the day like Mafia 2 opted for, and then having us stick around until the end of it so we could observe the aftermath of the antics we just got up to. So as a result, Tommy getting stuck in with the mob felt a bit rushed. From there, unlike say Mafia 2 where you got a sense of working one's way up the ranks and meeting hurdles along the way, Tommy is immediately trusted and respected, and it feels unearned. All that changes is his clothing to symbolise his rise in ranks, but the Salieri crime family isn't elaborated enough for us to believe there are ranks. And there are other things that are expected to be understood despite not necessarily being adequately shown. Things that feel like they got lost in the pacing towards the start, and the end in particular. For instance, where's the friction that carries the plot to its end point? While we're led to believe it's there as this narrative reaches its end, the Don starts contradicting his own rules and poorly plots to rob a bank to find an out to the mobster way of life. A lot of moments that might bring progression to these abrupt changes feel absent. I get the general themes of family, guilt, loyalty and the illusion of honour, and friendship in organised crime. The idea that it may be glamorous and exciting to a certain bored taxi driver, but entirely untenable as a way to live for a family man. But when the plot pivots to make those commentaries, it's abrupt, and the impact always hits the same note. Sam betraying Tommy and Paulie comes out of nowhere, because the plot has Paulie contemplating hitting a bank in one mission, then we immediately cut to that bank robbery, when surely there was some in-between moment where the plan became serious, and the divide between Tommy, Paulie and Sam grew somehow, in wake of the revelation Don Salieri is no longer adhering to his no-drug rule, and is keeping that information from the trio, ripping them off. There's no cards on the table moment with Salieri either, so he's kind of cut out of the ending, until we see him in prison at least briefly. So ultimately it feels like the ending is missing major chunks to how we got there. The story doesn't flesh out its moments very well by having us observe the build-up or aftermath too extensively, because it was trying to be a faithful recreation of a title almost 2 decades old by 2020, where the moment was all the game had, and even then what it adds doesn't necessarily pull it towards more gradual delivery. And it's not like the game's story would have gotten too long if we couldn't see more of it. I think it took me 6 hours, 7 tops, to record it end to end for this video. And that's not to say they needed to flesh out everything more, or even most things, but I did feel there were shortcomings at certain points. It's okay to be great and not a masterpiece though, and there's plenty of greatness here to latch onto. But to leave more insightful commentaries to those with superior brains, let's shift off discussing the narrative and wrap things up with the side content. Mafia Definitive Edition is a linear game set in an open world as a backdrop rather than an open world game by genre, which is confusing to some, but I've always respected that about the Mafia series. Aside from 3 of course, that is more or less a long-winded argument for why the other games aren't non-linear. But yes, surprisingly, in freeride mode, there are side bits to do, even with this being the most no-nonsense story or nothing Mafia game, at least prior to the old country. So the side content is very thin on the ground and pretty flat. In freeride mode, there's a bloke named Herbert Baskerville whose name is an absolute story in itself. He leaves notes around Salieri's bar for us to find. We have to go to phone booths and receive a text message somehow through them that tasks us with doing some relatively mundane and uninspired tasks, albeit with challenging constraints. I like how we're also told the message will self-destruct in 5 seconds, only for nothing to happen. His in-game model is a bloke with a dog head, which I'm led to believe is an Easter egg to an OG version glitch. At least it's a German Shepherd though, that's a proper dog. I promise you I'm not biased in any way whatsoever. There are also hidden cars in the world. Now that's a delightful throwback. Secret cars hidden across the map that can only be found at certain locations as a bit of meat for the free ride to chew on. Can't go far wrong with that. The only other thing that I can recall is the car cyclopedia that allows us to drive cars around the race mission's racetrack, and we have to complete a lap before we run out of time by topping up our time hitting checkpoints. I don't know if there's a timer leaderboard for that, or if doing this lap means anything. There doesn't appear to be anything to it. We just drive cars around the track and either avoid the hay bales across most of the width of the track at points, or don't, and it doesn't really matter. And then once we've completed a lap, it just resets, and we go again, or we go back to the menu. It isn't awfully satisfying overall. Just let me drive the monstrous race car in freeride, please. Everything else is collectibles, cigarette cards, dime detective magazines, mystery foxes, etc. You get the idea. Some of it fleshes out the world a bit in passing, like newspapers to read. That you can do in the story, but if you're resorting to free ride to do some completionist things, I find it hard to imagine you won't quickly find yourself questioning your life choices. All the free ride mode is really worth it for is to explore the backdrop of Lost Heaven, and to do so while dressed as a clown, because who doesn't love clowns? Particularly clowns with knives. The saving grace of all this, of course, is the side stuff really isn't the game's priority, or it would have been open world and non-linear to a point. The story being linear is practically a communication, there's nothing special beyond it, and that's fine by me. What else is there to talk about? Art style? I mean, the HUD's a bit milky and does the job, the loading screens bring an I pissed the bed energy to the family function, and the map is kinda alright, but yeah, nothing else to add. The graphics look nice, it's a good visual feast of a game with an emphasis on its atmosphere and simulation of a city from the 1930s. But overall it rode too hard on the idea of being an 18-year-old game under the bonnet, and I think it deserved to be more than that. So I conclude this video here. Mafia Definitive Edition 5 years later is still fantastic, but it stumps its own toe. It did a lot for the casual player to recreate this classic and bring it to a modern audience, perhaps casual players who wouldn't consider playing an older game. But I don't think it reimagined Mafia enough, as you can very clearly tell the game is built off the back of something much older. But that didn't make it terrible. In fact, if it could be as good as it is without reinventing itself in every department, that's, if anything, a testament to how good the first Mafia game must have been. I've never played it, but let me know if I'm right. So anyway, I conclude this video there. Thank you all for watching. I really hope you've enjoyed. If you did, be sure to go ahead, leave a like, subscribe, maybe share the channel with your friends, all that wonderful stuff. Only do any of that if you want to, of course. And with any luck, I'll be seeing you all very soon with another video at some point. Until next time, take care and goodbye.